Hello everyone, welcome to NPTEL course on remote sensing and GIS for rural development. This is week 1, lecture 2. In the first class, we had an introduction to the course material. We looked at each and every week what will be covered. We discussed about the books that will be used and the materials. And we have introduced the personnel of this course, including 2 TAs, Mr. Pranad M and Mr. Praveen Kulli. Also, I had mentioned that this course will have a very basic introduction to GIS and remote sensing. However, students should or by themselves learn remote sensing and GIS, and multiple courses already exist in NPTEL. Please don't keep this as a limitations for this course, because understanding rural development is very key, and remote sensing and GIS is a tool for rural development. So in this course, you will see how we gel an issue, a problem in the country with a solution providing tool like remote sensing and GIS. On this note, today we will also look at some more introduction material for rural development to define the term rural development. And we will also look into what are the mandates by the government. Because rural development is very, very important, we have a ministry dedicated for that, and that is called Ministry of Rural Development. You can see it on the screen, the logo, and the link below, which gives more resources to understand what is the ministry, who is the central union minister, and the state level bureaucracies associated. You will find an organization chart to understand the hierarchy. But most important, and also most important for this course, is the details that you can find on this website on rural development and how the ministry is aiding rural development. Initially, as I said, India is still an agrarian nation with almost 70% of the population in rural areas. Everyone knows that we are 1/7 the population of the world. So think about 70% of a billion people living in rural entities. It's tremendous opportunities for development to bring their lifestyles up, to bring their economic status up, and also to handhold solutions with them so that they can develop by their own, which is sustainable development, independent development. So as I said, India is still an agrarian nation, 69% of population in rural areas. Rural development is key to the national growth. When I say national growth, it's not the food product alone, but a lot of GDP is being supported by the rural agencies, rural entities. The development in urban sectors also comes through the rural sectors. For example, you can have a city which is thronging, but the food for the city comes from rural entities. The water comes from rural entities. Recharge, groundwater, everything are mostly taken from rural entities. The raw material for the industries, it could be chemical industries, can come from rural agencies. Distilleries, they take sugar, molasses from rural entities, right? Protein comes from rural agencies. So you cannot isolate a nation's growth without interlinking rural and urban. And you cannot say that engineering or technology doesn't require rural entities. It does, right? So rural development is key to national growth. If the percentage was less, let's say 10% of rural population is spread, then yes, okay, we can say that okay, the 90% is in urban or peri-urban, 10% is rural. We don't have to care much about, because that can, it will be the other way around, right? The urban centers will cater to the rural, but that is not the case. We do have countries like that, and I do have a slide to explain about how developed countries are working. We are a developing nation, right? Where still we need to push the GDP of the rural entities to contribute more to the growth of India. If you go to rural villages, you will still see the minimum labor is very less, and the annual income for a household is very, very less compared to an urban center. Maybe 10 times less, 12 times less, or even more. So we need to bring them also up to the healthy levels. We cannot bring same, it won't be possible because cost of living is also there. But at least can we bring them up to a sustainable level is important. And so there's a ministry for this. Like you have a ministry for information technology, you have a ministry for communication, roads. You do have a ministry for rural enterprises and rural development. So rural development, the word doesn't just say land development, it doesn't say economic development. It should encompass everything that goes into the economic betterment of people. Betterment, not parallel income to the urban centers. It is betterment so that they live a better standard of life. They can afford to be protected against climate extremes. You do see a lot of issues in farming and farming communities, which is much high compared to urban communities, right? If there's a flood, you can stay in your high-rise apartments in an urban city. You can have a lift to go up and then just stay there. But in a rural entity, it's still not available. You don't have high-rise apartments, right? So they are in the flood-prone regions. More importantly, you can work from home. You can work online if you're in an urban center. But rural, the livelihood is the ground, right? So if a flood comes, it gets damaged, and that is what is happening currently everywhere. Climate change has impacted mostly the vulnerable people, and the vulnerable people are in the rural regions in India. So they need to be developed, and that is where rural development, the word, coins also economic betterment of the people. And within the economic, I include resilience to climate, health, better health facilities, education facilities, connectivity. Everything comes with economic betterment. And with better economic accessibilities to funds, you have a greater social transformation. The entire rural entity will grow together, and that is very, very important for rural development to happen. And rural development contributes to national sustainable goals. Rural development also comes in sustainable goals, sustainable development goals, right? So how do you do a greater social transformation is by empowering the rural communities through rural development activities and handholding them throughout the journey. However, there are many stressors, factors that pull the development scenario down. We need to be very careful on these stressors. We need to identify how to lessen the stressors. Sometimes it's difficult to totally take it out of the system. So the better aspect is map the stresses, understand the stresses, and from the mapping and understanding, you can lessen the impact or lessen the stresses in the system. For example, you have crops, and a particular type of insect is affecting it. But the insect is driven by climate change. So, how do you suddenly take climate change out of the picture? You cannot. But you can understand the phenomenon, and through understanding, you can lessen the stressor. But we don't really have a detailed map or a detailed uh, physical report of where these stresses exist and how they exist. And that is what we're going to do in this interesting non-traditional lecture. So the NPTEL course discusses about rural development and how can you attain rural development using remote sensing and GIS. Please differentiate that. You cannot just have a map in the hand and say rural development will happen. No. So there is a intermediate phase, whereas you have a map, you have data, the data provides solutions, the solutions provides rural development. Okay. So it will be too long if I could add all these in the title. So that is why we have kept it as remote sensing and GIS for rural development. So once we understand that there is a lot of stresses, the next factor is who are working to lessen the stresses. We cannot expect that every time the government will identify these stresses, provide data, and then tackle it because it's too many. The land holding size in India is very small, but too many stresses. So to expect at every stage the government can intervene is difficult. And that is why we need to have participation, not from the top down alone, which is the government to the people, but also the people to the government, bottom up. And this course will help you to build capacity, understand tools, remote sensing and GIS, for example, understand tools that can help you get into this participation phase. It's a very important sector where it's not only government, it's not only public, but a public private government partnership. And through that, there is rural development. So, on this, as I said, there is an agency for rural development. It was initially started in 1974. The government realized after independence that the population is still a lot concentrated in the rural areas, and we need to acknowledge that we cannot jump into industry like different countries. We need to slowly grow industry and rural enterprises, for which we need to have a statutory body to look at the development. So this government agency for rural development was started in 1974, and there has been a lot of changes in the name and how it was called, what was the mandate. So what happens when a name changes is the mandates also change. For example, there could be an agency on agriculture. Agriculture could include water, crops, etc. But there's also an agency on irrigation, dams and hydropower, etc. So as the name changes, you do have a difference in the verticals or the mandates of the agency. So for now, the agency is called Ministry of Rural Development. And to understand the different mandates, where they work, how they work, I recommend you to go to the website, which is given below, and read about it. I particularly put the link to About Ministry. You can read what are the mandates about the ministry, where they work, how they work, and what is important to the system. We'll also get different numbers like 69%, as I mentioned here. We'll get the different numbers about populations, the demographics, how many are women, men, the population which is educated or access to education, the health, and more importantly, as I said, the government acknowledges that this is a very, very important sector. So there's a lot of funds that have been kept. So this website can also give you how much funds have been kept for these schemes, what are the schemes for rural development, and how are we on track to achieve rural development. Let's see some of the schemes under this Ministry of Rural Development. A very one important scheme that a lot of people are aware about, or at least know this name, is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It was first called as NREGA, NG or M Narega. Now it's called MG Narega. Okay, so Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So it is an act for providing wage employment because there was a lot of migration from rural to urban systems for money, work, labor, etc. They came not because they were willing to relocate, because they didn't have labor. They didn't have labor in the villages. It could be the land was not producing as much, or a climate change impact like a flood or drought hit the land, so there was nothing growing for them to do work. So they started to move. However, we wanted the rural entities to look at different livelihood options. And that is one of the reasons that the government has pushed this MG Narega Act, where they provide guaranteed income for farmers. And there is a team which uses the farmers' labor or the rural people's labor for development. One is to develop water resources. One is to develop highways and road infrastructure for connectivity. There are multiple schemes under the MG Narega. The other one is the National Rural Livelihood Mission for self-employment and skill development. So there are infrastructures that are created under this scheme for self-employment. How do you do cottage industries, packaging of rural produce, processing of rural produce, food processing, value addition. All these would be under the self-employment skills. And there are a lot of industries, though they don't need a degree, they need skills, hands-on skills. For example, how can you assemble a scooter? You don't need to have to bring a degree for it, but a skill on how the electronics works, how the engineering works, etc. And that skill development can be given as a diploma using these schemes. So that is what a National Rural Livelihood Mission scheme is about. Housing for all. So we do know that rural entities have sometimes still living in mud houses and or which are being impacted by climate change extremes. So the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin, which is PMAYG, is for providing houses under the poverty line. So BPL is below poverty line households. So this scheme identifies the people under the poverty line and provides them subsidies to build houses. You would have seen these houses across the villages. They look very similar in some aspects, especially in Tamil Nadu. There is a state development budget which is given to fabricated houses or houses that look very similar. Within a budget, they have the plan, they have contractors which just build the houses and give to the below poverty line. In this central government agency, you can also ask for funds to top it up. Then we have the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana for construction of quality roads. As I said, connectivity is very important for development, especially rural development. So how do you connect the rural to the urban centers? Is through quality roads. And so this scheme, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, looks into the construction of quality roads. Then we have the National Social Assistance Program for social pension in rural entities, and the Shyam Prasad Mukherjee Urban Mission. So there is urban There is rural, and in between you also have rural or conversion of rural to urban, or on the periphery of the urban. How does a rural entity coexist? And this coexist does not fit into the urban sector, nor does it fit entirely in the rural sector. So for that, there is a mission created to understand the needs and development of this segment. This is a very important segment, right? So you have urban, you have rural, and in between there should be a bridge, and that bridge community could be the rural one. And the IWMP, as I said, water has been acknowledged as the key resource, the most important priority resource for rural entity. And for that, there is an integrated watershed management program, IWMP, for improving the productivity of the land, to safeguard the soil, to safeguard the fertility of the land. There's multiple mandates under the scheme, and everything comes with IWMP. You would see sometimes these schemes could also coexist. For example, Manrega labor can be put in the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, where you pay the rural people labor to help construct the roads. The roads could be constructed just not by machines, but you also need to remove some weeds and some trees and stuff, right? If a road is being built. So how do you put these two together? But what you see mostly is the MG Narega and IWMP working together, wherein the farmers and rural laborers are used to construct new water resource structures in the villages, or rehabilitate and maintain some water resources like lakes, ponds, check dams. Those are the things which come under the IWM. We will cover how to use this remote sensing and GIS for many of these schemes. So all these schemes need not use remote sensing and GIS, but we will focus on the schemes that have to use remote sensing and GIS for these schemes. There's also a need for cross-cutting team capacities. So let's look at rural development as a whole. There is agriculture. There's always food production. There is all this. When I say agriculture, it does also include your other livelihoods such as aquaculture, cattle, etc., etc. Agriculture is not only for food, but that segment, let's keep it as a green segment for all the agriculture related activities. And then there is also ecosystem and livelihood, which is the forest, the lakes, the rivers that have to be kept so that livelihood options are live. For example, if you have a healthy river, you have healthy fish. Okay? Aquaculture is where you have separate systems for water and fish, but you also have your rivers and oceans and your lakes and ponds that have fish, which are tied to the ecosystem. Ecosystem is the interaction between life and abiotic sectors like rocks, sand, land, etc., and the trees, and how do they coexist? So you have to keep that intact for rural development. Then you have domestic use and sanitation, which is the people, the rural people's need. They need water for drinking, they need water for bathing, ablution, and sanitation. So, how do you improve that for rural development? How do you improve agriculture for rural development? How do you improve ecosystem and livelihoods for rural development? And most importantly, nowadays, is how do you lessen climate change impacts to safeguard rural development? Because when a flood comes, your rural land is gone. How do they have livelihood? How do they have food? How do they have agriculture? Right? So now there is a need for cross-cutting themes for one rural development. You have to have agriculture. You have to also account for climate change impacts and understand how much domestic need is there. So if you give water for agriculture and livelihoods, but do not take care of domestic needs, how will they survive? Right? So that is encompassing all of it, and cross-cutting themes are there for rural development. Of these factors, water security is key. As I said, we need to understand, we need to acknowledge that Water security is key, and it does include a lot of sectors across this. For example, water is needed for agriculture, water is needed for livelihoods, water is needed for domestic use and sanitation, and climate change impacts water. So one example is water, as I said, but there are other sectors also. For example, there is power. Power is needed for agriculture, pumping, processing the food. Livelihoods is needed for processing the food, etc. You need power. For domestic use and sanitation, you need to clean the water. You need power. And during extremes climate change, you need power to sustain your livelihoods. So there are multiple sectors. Water security is key. Let's look at a small example of rural water management scenario. What is water security? And the UN agency has clearly differentiated the word with other systems. It says drinking water and human well-being. As I said, domestic use. We need to have enough water for domestic use. We need to have enough to sustain the population in rural entities. Also, we need enough water to sustain the ecosystem, which is the trees, the rocks, the soil. You need to have enough water, and that is what is kept as ecosystem services. Water related hazards and climate change, we have to understand, we have to protect water during the climate change. So there could be a pollution, there could be a scenario where too much heat, all your water is evaporating, etc. And economic activities and development requires water. As I said, the economic activity could be fish or cattle, which requires a lot of water, right? So there should be good governance as per UN water. What it says that you need to have good governance for managing water. You need to have transboundary cooperations between states, between countries, between districts to share water. There should be good financing to protect water resources and peace and political stability. So on the left, it has defined as drinking water is safe and equitable water available for all, and is it affordable? So a bottled water you find in the cities, is it that affordable for a public in rural entities? It is not. Okay? You still find in rural entities people would purify the water, filter the water, and then drink. Or put it in containers, pots, and then drink. You don't see people buying just bottled water, okay, which is use and throw. This is like you refill, right? But the other water you use and throw, which is really harmful for the environment, single-use plastic. So is it affordable is key. And the next is economy. Is adequate water available for sustaining the livelihood? As I said, it could be your cattle or aqua fish, or it could also be something related to rural entities like washing, food value addition, uh, garments making, right? So you need a lot of water for washing, dyeing. Is it there? Is it done in a sustainable way? Ecosystems, is adequate water available for biotic, which is your trees, your grass, your birds, animals. Abiotic systems is your soil in regions, and aids for sustaining nature. Is nature uh, kept at least near to pristine conditions? Is nature protected? Resilience is enough water available during climate change extremes, which includes floods and droughts. So this is what UN Water has discussed. And as you could see, all of this is very, very important for rural development. You need people to drink good water. You need economic activity to be around so that they have rural development, economic development. They live very close to nature compared to urban cities. So there's a lot of trees, birds, animals that need water. And more importantly, they're more vulnerable to climate change. So biggest issues are for agriculture and water. I hope you all agree that we see that a lot of water has been tapped, and there is biggest issues for agriculture. So as I promised, I would like to show you how it is different in water resources between countries. So we are a population of nearly 1 billion, and out of which we do have 70% living in rural areas. Let's see how that compares when they use water in different countries. So in a world average, 70% of water is used in agriculture, the first diagram, 8% is used for domestic use, and 22% is for industry. This is the world average. In low middle income countries and developing economies, including India, you see that 82% is used for agriculture, 10% for industries, and 8% for domestic. So we are on the world average, which means the world's domestic population is getting 8%, we are also getting 8%, we are fine. But we are limiting our industrial use and putting more water in agriculture, right? Let's look at high income countries, and this includes the Western countries, European countries. You could see that 60% of the water is used for industries, 30% is used for agriculture, whereas 11% is domestic. So definitely they have better life standards. They have better living conditions because they have more water for their personal use. So domestic consumption is high. It's not very high compared to 8%, but still there's good water and enough water available. The most concern is this industrial demand. See, industry products is valued high compared to an agricultural product. A car is much more expensive than a rice bag, right? Or you can take even a lorry of a rice. It is not as expensive as a car that is being produced. So you could see how smart these high income countries are. What they do, they put more water in industry, and that industrial produce is sold across the world for really high cost. For example, mobile phones. Mobile phones were initially made in across the world, and then we were buying it, right? But the water, if our farmers are using for agriculture, say rice and stuff, when they export it, it's not the same. So 1 liter of water has high economic value when it is spent for industry compared for food. A quick example I can give is grapes. You can water a grape plant and then take it, pluck it, and eat it as a grape, table grape, we say, just as a fruit. But when there is an industry that processes the grapes, puts it in barrels, and then puts it in a bottle as wine, the price almost goes 10 times, right? So that is industry, and this is agriculture and food. So there is big disparity in water. And the concern part is the low and middle income countries are still kept as the food providers, and they consume a lot of water. They don't have enough water to even lift their living standards, whereas the high income and developed countries continue to buy food from these underdeveloped countries and put more water in the industry, right? So this is where you see the 8% and 11% difference, because they don't have high agriculture demands. They have very less agriculture demands. The rural population is very less. They have more population in industries, in cities. So coming back to us, for our development, we need to develop water resources, and we do need to develop water in the rural entities so that we can develop rural economies. With this, I will stop today's lecture. We will see in the next lecture. Thank you.